Let's turn now to the sociocultural tradition of research and look at some of the theories within it about the conversation. So first, the sociocultural tradition looks at how people structure their conversations. It looks at how we manage our conversational difficulties, like you have little issues that you have to figure out how to get through during the moment. You might say something a little wrong and figure that out. It also looks at how we navigate our conversations around certain topics. We might manage our multiple goals while we're talking, and we perform and maintain our desired identities through conversation. So you might have more than one goal in a conversation. Let's, for example, say that you are trying to maintain a very positive, supportive relationship with this person, but you also have to tell them some bad news. And so the way you approach that conversation in the moment is going to be pursuing both of those goals. This is one of the reasons why we don't just shout out bluntly, all the bad news. We try to figure out a way to break it to somebody, because we know there's more at stake here than just telling them the bad news. There's a way to say it that helps them remain positive about your relationship with them. So these are some of basic examples of what the sociocultural tradition looks at. One of the most common areas in the sociocultural tradition that looks at conversations is called conversational analysis. And this is not exactly a theory, one particular theory. It's more of a general approach, a methodological approach for studying conversations. And it is one that carefully examines everyday talk. These conversations that they're looking at, for example, are recorded, often on audio or audio-video, and they pause these things and transcribe every word line by line. They might even transcribe how long each pause is and any mispronunciations or unique ways that people are talking. And it's not cleaned up, so to speak. In fact, every little nuance of the way people talk is accentuated and highlighted in the way they transcribe these things. And people in this area of research look at how we get things done cooperatively through talk. They're not saying that people are shaking hands and being super cooperative, but instead how people achieve things socially through a set of unwritten conversational norms. So how is it that without ever telling each other the rules, that we managed to do things like take turns, manage our silences and pauses relatively effectively, manage the extent to which we have overlapping talk or interruptions, try to figure out the right way to say things, so we might restart what we're saying or repair a sentence that didn't come out quite right. And we figure out how to express ourselves in conversation with the other person. And even though we don't necessarily go in with a plan, if you look at recordings, even difficult conversations on recordings, people actually do have these structural elements in common. There's a lot of research done, for example, on phone calls involving breakups. So I listened to this fascinating call once, and even though the person was getting broken up with, they managed to handle it in a way that was organized. So the person said, "Hey, I'm just calling and wanted to talk to you." "Oh, sure, what is it you wanted to talk about?" And so they took turns, and he said, "Well, I really think you're great, but things were just really busy lately." They'd only been dating, I think, several weeks, so it wasn't like the most serious call. But they managed this difficult conversation relatively effectively. And by the way, even when people argue and have a big blowout, they still take turns. They still have pauses. There's overlapping talk, and not necessarily supporting overlapping talk, but it's still there and you can analyze it. And they will say things and maybe repair those statements if they didn't say them quite right. So you see these elements in all of our conversations. There's another thing we do is usually we have a set of unspoken conversational maxims or premises about what we expect in a conversation. And usually a conversation will start to feel funny if one of these four things is off. If one of them violates what we would normally expect in a conversation, And then we start to feel funny, like, wait a minute, something's going on here, right? So the first one is quantity. If somebody we expect the proper amount of information for a given topic. So if somebody gives us either too much information, they're rattling on and on and on about something that doesn't seem to need that much information, we might think, what's going on here? This person seems really defensive, or they seem totally nervous about this. Or they don't give enough information. They are very brief, where we might expect a little more information. So the classic example that I heard from a professor years ago when I was in graduate school, he said, so let's say your child wants to borrow the car. You're grown and you have kids who now drive, and you say, sure, but first let me ask you some questions. Where are you going with the car? And your teenage child says, out. See, quantity, that's not exactly the proper amount. You'd expect a little more. And then you dig deeper because you feel funny about that, and you say, well, who are you going out with? And they say, friends. Okay, once again, if you're a father or a mother and that's the answer, that's not enough. So you say, well, when are you going to be back? And they say, later. There's something wrong with the amount of information they're giving. They're being so brief that even if those things are 100% true, they're going out with friends and they'll be back later. I mean, that's probably a pretty good summation of what's happening. They're not giving enough details there for you to feel like that conversation went in a normal way. And I would bet close to 100% of you would not let the child use the car. You might not be able to explain why, but you feel funny about it. You don't say, well, your quantity, you didn't give me the proper amount of information. You might not say that in the moment. You might just feel something's wrong here, and I'm sensing that I'm not going to give you the car. Quality is another reason that we don't feel right about the way a conversation is going. In other words, truthfulness. If somebody says something that we know is not true, maybe they're giving you inconsistent statements, for example. Maybe they're saying something that you know is not true because you have already heard otherwise from a reliable source, then that's obviously going to signal something. Like, let's say you talk to two different roommates that owe you some rent, and one of them says, well, I only get paid once every 2 weeks, and so does my roommate, so we can't pay you the rent on time because we don't have our check. And then the other roommate doesn't know that you talked to that first one, and they call you and say, well, I get paid every week, and so I'm getting my check, but it's not going to be enough to cover the rent. Then you think, well, wait a minute. These both can't be correct. And you know, without ever saying anything to them, that something's not truthful here. So you know something is going on. Relevance is where the person either communicates in a way that corresponds or relates to the previous statement, or it doesn't. Maybe they give you a comment that is off topic and doesn't quite relate, like they're changing the subject. Well, that signals something that there might be some trouble there. So you're trying to have a conversation about one thing and they switch the topic to something else that's not relevant. Well, that signals there might be an issue there. So this is a really plain example, but maybe you ask somebody out, and this actually happened to a friend of mine. You ask somebody out, and instead of acknowledging the question, the person just changes the topic and starts talking about the weather or sports or something else. It does not relate to the previous statement, and so if you're paying attention, you realize that it's not that they didn't hear you, it's just that they don't want to have that conversation because the answer is going to be no and they don't know how to say it, and so they just swerved around it by giving you an irrelevant statement. And that should signal to you, oh, they said no. I just didn't hear the word no, but really they avoided it. Manner is the way someone expresses themselves in it's not organized or not an understandable way. So if they you're not going to notice this, the manner that they're speaking in, if they communicate normally. You only notice it when they don't communicate in an organized and understandable way. And this is going to be weird and troublesome. So a friend of mine was once in a bank, and he was sitting there waiting for help. You know, you're sitting in the area where you're waiting for someone to, help you open an account or deal with something where you have to sit down and talk to someone. And he was just reading a magazine, and someone in the seating area with him, near him, was going on and on, having a conversation, a long conversation, and he wasn't paying attention because he was reading a magazine. And then the person next to him sort of was staring at him, and he looked at the person like, "Why are you staring at me?" And then the person that was staring at him looked over to draw his attention to the person who was going on and on this conversation. And my friend looked up from the magazine and realized that person having this conversation wasn't talking to anybody. They were just talking like a crazy person sitting in the bank, like prattling on and on to an imaginary person, talking to themselves, talking to someone they imagined, and there was no Bluetooth in their ear or anything. They were just going on and on. And so my friend looks up from his magazine and he thinks, "Whoa, like this is crazy. What's going on here?" The person is not communicating in an organized, understandable way. They're having a crazy, random, rambling conversation with nobody. And so that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but sometimes you'll hear people and you can't really follow what's going on, and that usually signals some trouble. And so this area of research, conversation analysis, looks at the way people respond to each other during conversation, and they evaluate these. They study those moment-to-moment moves. And violations of these four maxims in conversations usually signal some kind of trouble that then the other communicator has to respond to. So let's turn to the rhetorical tradition. Even though rhetoric is usually about communicating from one person to many, an audience in a debate format or a speech or something similar, the rhetorical tradition around conversation actually does have a lot to offer. The most well-known theory, I would say, in terms of conversation in the rhetoric area is symbolic convergence theory. Sometimes people call this the fantasy theme analysis, and you can just use those terms interchangeably. Symbolic convergence theory is the same thing, or another way to say fantasy theme analysis. Somewhere along the line in this long area of research, they just started calling it something different. But it means the same thing, and it's from the same group of people that created it. And so what this means is, like this small group of people speaking here in the image, is that when we communicate, especially in groups of people, we share our stories, we talk to each other in stories, and that storytelling, that shared experience of storytelling, guides our situation and how we view our group and our situation. So let's say you're hanging out and you're talking, and someone starts making a little bit of a joke about a class that you're all in, and then the other person jumps in on that joke or tells another part of the story, and then that group collectively creates a story and experiences a story that then the group owns that story. It becomes part of that group's shared reality, that shared consciousness. And you had to be there during these conversations to understand exactly what it meant. It's like an inside joke, you know. It's funny to the people who were there when it first developed. Other people don't get it. And so shared stories are a lot like inside jokes, where the people in the group understand them. These stories are often told and retold, and they're known situations by the group. In fact, you might bring up a story, and before you even get into the story, people start laughing and thinking it's so, "Oh, this is great, you know, you're going to love this story," even if they've heard it before, because they know what's coming, because they've been told so many times. They often involve what we call symbolic cues or triggers. These are words where it's a little shorthand way of describing what's going on. And everybody hears that cue, and they know that you're about to launch into that story. And even if you don't tell the whole story, you might just bring up the phrase, and because everybody's heard the story so many times, it signals that story, that shared story, in everybody's minds. So in my house, where I grew up, the phrase dog poo means something pretty specific, and because it comes from a story. And it's probably not going to be a very funny story for you, because you are not part of that group that first experienced it, but in my family, it gets everybody laughing. So a long time ago, I grew up with a dog in the house, and my my two first nephews were visiting, and they were in the front yard playing. And we were all at my parents' house, the house I grew up in. And my mom had not basically picked up the dog poo in the front yard. And so my two nephews, who were, 4 and 6 years old, were playing in the front yard, running around. And my mother was horrified and realized, oh my gosh, I haven't picked up the dog poo in a while. They're probably going to run all through this dog poo, and it's going to get all of their shoes, and they're going to bring it to the house. And she worried about this. And so she saw them outside running around the front yard, and instead of calmly exiting the room she was in, finding the front door, and going to talk to them, she started banging her hands on the window, the closed window that went to that was, she could see them playing in the front yard. She started banging with her fists on the window like a crazy person, and yelling out their names: Gunner, Hunter, dog poo, dog poo. And they couldn't hear her. They're on the other side of the window, and so they could basically hear some sounds coming out. They heard their names, they heard dog poo, but she wasn't really making full sentences. She was just screaming out dog poo, and she had this crazy look on her face. Now, I heard a little bit of it, and then I walked in to see what was going on because it was a ruckus, and I saw what was going on. But from the other room, I could hear her yelling, dog poo, dog poo. And then I looked out and I saw that she was calling to Gunner and Hunter, and I saw the two kids' faces in the front yard, and they were looking. They had stopped in their tracks in the front yard, and they were looking at where my mother was calling from, the window, and they looked absolutely horrified and confused at their grandmother completely losing her mind. They had no idea what she was doing. And so it was really no big deal, right? I mean, my mother, you could say she overreacted in this situation. And so everybody kind of laughed, and the kids came in, and they, we told them what was going on, and they laughed too, and they thought grandma was a little crazy. But to this day, now that's, 20 something years ago, right? Now to this day, every once in a while when my family's all together for Thanksgiving or Christmas, you'll hear in some distant corner of the house somebody saying, dog poo! And you just know they're telling that story. And even though you can't hear the story, that symbolic cue or trigger activates that memory and that whole scene. And we exaggerate these things over time. By the way, we make my mother look a little crazier than she was, and we make it more, the stories are called fantasy theme analysis because part of it is based in reality. But also, we take these stories and we exaggerate them, and we continue them, and we put in little things, and they become part real, part fantasy. And that's why they added this fantasy theme part. It's not just about converging through symbolic means or storytelling. It's about how part of this is real and part of it is fantasy. And the fantasy part of this is one of the magical elements that make the group feel that they have a shared consciousness. It tells the group members, we're part of the group because we all know this story. We were all part of it, and we understand it. And people that from the outside don't exactly understand it. So those are the traditions of research that we're going to look at in terms of conversation. There's a lot here to talk about, a lot of very interesting theories. I'm sure some of them you can hear applying directly to your life. And in the next set of videos, we're going to expand this a little bit more and add the element of time to this back and forth conversation, and we'll talk about the relationship.